afternoon. Welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. The cultural historian Christopher Dawson, he has been dubbed one of the foremost Catholic thinkers of modern times, especially as it pertains to engaging the faith at the heart of the culture. He retired from Harvard in 1962. John XXIII sent him an apostolic blessing, and Dawson once observed that the first step in the transformation of culture is a change in the pattern of culture within the mind. Joseph Stuart joins us to talk more about Dawson and cultural transformation. Joseph Stuart is Program Chair of History and a Fellow of Catholic Studies at the University of Mary. He's also the author of this wondrous work, Christopher Dawson, A Cultural Mind in the Age of the Great War. Joseph, it's so great to speak with you. How are you?
I am doing well. Thank you, sir, for having me on today.
I have to tell you, you and I are kindred spirits. My predecessor had a deep appreciation for Dawson, and so he introduced me to him. And when I found out about your work and I had read the review of it, I realized that you are someone who shares a similar concern for making sure that the faith, which is the soundest, most objective measure of the truth, is spoken into the heart of the culture. So I want to ask you to open with, why is it more important now than ever to reclaim the thought and the work of people like Christopher Dawson?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I want to just try to answer by quoting briefly from Pope John Paul, who said this. He said, a quote, "A faith that does not become culture is not fully accepted, not entirely thought out, not faithfully lived." Yeah. Unquote. And that's one of the famous quotations from him about the importance of culture and living out one's faith in the world. And I think that sometimes when the wider secular culture seems to be very oppressive and threatening, we want to retreat into ourselves and kind of think of the faith as kind of a private thing for my family or my club rather than a communal social reality that is meant to go out into all the nations and all the world around us. Right. And I think that the recovery of Christopher Dawson and his work is a powerful reminder of this reality that the faith must become culture.
You know, Joseph, I couldn't agree more. And frankly, one of the things that I do is I try to track back in history as to when we started losing sight of stuff like that. And sure, we can track it back to especially the Reformation, but especially in modernity, we have completely misconstrued the faith we profess as an entirely privatized enterprise. And it's never been historically that way. The history of anthropology shows the faith of a society completely defines the direction of its culture.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's right. And what Dawson is doing is really interesting is, in the early 20th century, many Catholic thinkers were engaging with theology or with philosophy or the arts or literature, people like Chesterton and others. Yeah. But very few of them were engaging the modern mind at where it was heading, which was in the fields of history, the social sciences, and sociology. And Dawson was one of the first and one of the greatest Catholics to engage with those kind of modern fields, which were showing the very truth that you just mentioned, right? Which is that when we look at the history of world cultures and how they develop, religion has always played a central role in that reality.
Right. And so it's a complete misrepresentation of human history to pretend that now we can be quote-unquote liberated from religion and therefore build a true human culture. If anything, the new atheism has shown us how it as an enterprise is its own failure.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And Dawson's, I think his greatest book, 1929, was called Progress and Religion. And it's an amazing book. I'm teaching it right now with my students here at the University of Mary. And it's a great book about how, religion is part of how the way that civilization first arose in the earliest temples and city-states of Mesopotamia. And, archaeology is confirming, to this day, these insights of Dawson's. So it's part of the development of human culture and human civilization is religion. And also, the flip side is the relationship to nature and the material world. And that's the wonderful thing about Dawson and the idea of culture, is that it's a concept that bridges between spirituality and religion on the one hand, and the human person as a creature, as a physical creature who lives within the context of nature on the other hand, right? So it's kind of an incarnational kind of idea. It's both spiritual and material, and a cultural development has to happen in terms of both of those sides.
And therein lies the issue, because if I may quote Dawson, as you've been doing, he made very clear, a society that has lost its religion has already lost its culture, which means that in order for us to understand what culture really is, we have to reclaim the source of that culture. Literally, what man worships shapes the way the society lives.
Yeah, and it's really exciting when you take that idea and you say, okay, we can see how that's true in the medieval period. We can see how that's true in, maybe ancient Egypt or something, which was a culture that was totally devoted to religion. But then you ask the question, how does that apply to today, right, in modern secular cultures, right? And this is the whole sort of flip side of Dawson's work, is showing, well, what it looks like, right, is that you create a spiritual vacuum inside our own contemporary modern secular cultures, which then sort of sucks into it or draws into it whatever kind of is happening in the spiritual environment, around it. And that's often a secular religion,
right,
like Nazism in the 20th century or communism and things. In America, it's things like, sports and the idea of progress and money and all these kinds of things that kind of become the guiding vision for a society.
Yep, and that's the problem. The guiding vision of a society will make or break its development in actual culture. And I've been doing commentaries on the devolution of our art. Because art becomes one of those visual representations that shows either the continued development and progress of culture or its actual inevitable corruption. And so look at the modern art that we have in comparison with what we've had in human history. The fact that we had an artist with the audacity to put a crucifix in urine shows us that we have embraced depravity and called it a commentary on society.
Yeah, that's right. There's many elements of modern culture which are showing a kind of decline. And Dawson talked about this. He's like, cultures can decline. We know that in history, the ancient Roman culture, eventually came to an end. There's been other societies that have failed for sometimes environmental reasons, but often it's because their vision failed. It failed to be passed on, and the break between the generations happened, and art becomes decadent or even ceases to exist, and so decline is a very real part of human history.
Yeah, and like Dawson mentioned, and like you just brought up, when we start seeing the decline of culture, we can actually track it back to where it first began, which was a social disinterest in religion. It happens at this juncture, this point in society where the collective populace suddenly decides that the faith has nothing to contribute to the way the society ought to live. And again, so morality is out of the question, epistemology is out of the question, logic is out of the question, the moment you cast, especially the Christian faith, out of the public sphere.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, in the European world, a key moment there was the French Revolution, beginning in 1789, which definitely tried to expel the Christian faith from, the public culture. And in our part of the world, the English-speaking world, I think it's maybe a little later. It's more and a slower, too, process of kind of conducted through industry and kind of the monetarization of culture and privatization of culture that has slowly kind of eroded much of the public witness. So I think that's a two-part process there, political in Europe and economic in our part of the world. But I think that's what we could say.
Yep, I couldn't agree more. So, and you're singing my song, bringing up the French Revolution. You and I are going to be here for the next hour at this point. You've got people like Robespierre, but you also had, and so the political movement is spearheaded, people like Marat, Roland, but they're spearheaded by thinkers who drove that. I mean, you think about Diderot, or worse, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and the complete divorce of reality from objective truth, as if the person interiorly ought to exist as an ethereal, separate notion from reality as is, which was a completely novel version of an epistemology that has resulted in the ruin of us understanding the human person.
Yeah, that's right, and that's one of the wonderful things about Dawson is that he's a realist. He believes, he knows that we can know things, we can know truth, and so his work is really complementary to philosophy's Thomas Aquinas. In a way, Dawson is the history of what Aquinas is to philosophy. In a way, because he's a realist, he's a philosophical realist. We can know the truth about the past, we can understand it, we can look into it, we can see the facts, and so I think that's part of his greatness too.
Yep. My guest is Joseph Stuart. He's joining us to talk more about Christopher Dawson and the question of cultural transformation. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm speaking with Joseph Stuart. about the Catholic historian and commentator Christopher Dawson, a cultural mind in the age of the Great War. Now, Joseph, you and I were talking about how, in a lot of senses, Dawson was a kind of prophet ahead of his time, because he saw how reading the ebbs and flows of the social sciences showed us where mankind was inevitably going. And, to quote him, the whole tendency of modern life is toward scientific planning, organization, central control, standardization, and specialization. And what he's really trying to highlight here is, as we move further and further away from God, we move further and further away from the meaning of the human person. And so this mechanization and overt efficiency-driven version of humanity tends to take over. And that's what we're seeing in the public sphere now. We are measured by productivity over and above true human flourishing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no, prophetic, I think, is a good way to put it. He was British. Grew up in rural Yorkshire in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, in a time when there was horse-drawn carriages. And then, he lived into 1970. So he lived beyond the dropping of the atomic bomb into the age of technology and science, and just an incredible range of change. And then, to cap it off, he came to teach at Harvard University at the end of his life. His last position was as professor of Catholic Studies at Harvard University, and he could see how modern culture was developing. He appreciated America in many ways, especially our tradition of free liberal arts, schools that are independent of the state. He thought that was amazing about America, but he definitely saw, those tendencies in our culture.
And one of the things that he winds up pointing out is that if we are not careful, education itself, just quoting him again, education itself becomes an essential part of the machine. The mind has to be completely measured and controlled by techniques of the scientific expert as the task which it is being trained to perform. So he cautioned us that if we don't catch ourselves, we're going to become an empiricist, materialist society, and therefore lose the capacity as a society to observe the transcendent and therefore contemplate the divine.
Yeah, his comments, not comments, his books, his writings on education are very profound, because you're right, he points to our modern public education as a serious part of the problem. Here's a brief quotation from here. He says, the central problem of the Catholic educationalist is a sociological one. Right. How to make students culturally conscious of their religion. Otherwise, they will be divided personalities with a Christian faith and a pagan culture which contradict one another. Yep. That's it. That's where we are. And so that's the analysis of our situation. The solution then, he began to write in his great book, The Crisis of Western Education, is to integrate those two things, right, and begin to understand through history how religion and culture have always integrated with each other, and that can inspire us anew then in the modern world.
Yep. And I want to expand the conversation a little into the big picture question. As a historian, this is a man who made himself a student of the documents, of the text, of the ebbs and flows of human occurrences, wars, events, but he viewed all of this through the lens of the faith that he had come to espouse as his own, the Catholic faith. And then he comes to the startling conclusion that he shares with all of us, that the Christian view of history is the only one which gives spiritual meaning to the whole course of human progress. We are often taught, especially in modernity right now, to see history as this constant struggle, this Hegelian Marxist view of conflict, the oppressor and the one being oppressed and overcoming that. And yet really it's the Christian narrative that gives meaning at all to the entirety of the flow of history.
Yeah, that's right. He wrote several essays that are just beautiful on this very, very theme, that the Judeo-Christian tradition is unlike any other world religion in the sense that it conceives of time not as meaningless and not as eternal cycles, as circles, but as having a beginning. God created the heaven and the earth, having a middle, when Jesus came, and then having an end, right? So in other words, it has a direction, which is the basis for a true sense of progress, right, that can underlie human development, and that's totally unique in the Christian tradition.
Right. Which presents us a real problem when we're looking at our modern culture as it is, just in this particular milieu. We're suffering a complete loss of the spiritual sense of what has brought us this human flourishing in our civilization as we know it. And so it would be in some sense a futile effort to pretend that we can regain a sense of societal sentiment of human flourishing if we don't regain as well the spirituality that drove it here from the get-go.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, his phrase was theological optimism.
Right.
If we lose that theological optimism, that time has a direction and a meaning, then we have to work, we try to work really hard to replace it with something else, right? And so our lives, we get up in the morning, and if we don't have that theological optimism, then we have to make something up. We got to create something. We're going to work really hard. We're going to make a lot of money. We're going to have a lot of honor. We're going to have a lot of pleasure. Whatever it is as a society, we replace that theological optimism with becomes our operating religion. But the problem is that that's a form of idolatry, and history also shows, what direction that these sort of pagan gods in history have gone is usually toward the destruction of the society and lots of blood sacrifices.
Yep. That is actually true. I wrote my dissertation on that, and it's inevitable. We devolve into that if we don't recapture the Christian narrative. There's a bit of a Gerardian premise here. If we remove Christ as the quote-unquote ultimate scapegoat, then we run the risk of bringing back some kind of bloodshed in the process. But really what I want to drive home here is Dawson was very clear. Christianity is factually the core dynamic element that drove Western civilization, which means we can't even begin to have a conversation on Western civilization if we don't acknowledge that its roots are Christendom.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so what's fascinating about Dawson's historical work is that he directed his readers' attention to the area of history most forgotten, which was the so-called Dark Age.
Right.
Right? When basically from 500, the time of St. Benedict, until maybe around 1000 with the conversion of the Vikings. That 500 years is when the Benedictine monks and missionaries were spreading out across Europe, bringing the faith to the tribal chiefs across the forests of Germany, building monasteries, and that ultimately laid the basis for a united, spiritually united continent that we call Europe, which is the bedrock of Western civilization, where our own culture in modern America comes from. And so he's pointing us to saying, look, guys, this is actually even more interesting than the time of Dante and Thomas Aquinas. That's really great and really fascinating. But what's almost more important, in a sense, is to see how that came about.
Right.
And that was in those early medieval time.
Right. And that's why the lie of the Dark Ages, these backwater peasants who didn't know any better until the enlightenment of the scientific empiricist revolution came about. This narrative of history, it's baffling to think that this is the standardized narrative that we buy today, when in reality those quote-unquote backwater peasants had a wider, a more expansive view of creation and reality, realizing that the material order was, in a sense, sacramental, lowercase s, pointing to the higher divine order. Yeah, absolutely. That's right. And that's another wonderful thing about Dawson's work is that he's not an elitist. No, in other words, he wants to understand people on their own terms and not dismiss them, and he wants to go into the past and he wants to see, okay, so what was the mentality, what is the profound insights of what we could say, primitive cultures, well, maybe not so primitive, maybe actually quite sophisticated in their view of reality as incarnational, like you said, as sacramental, right, as a mixture of material and spiritual reality, and he holds that up. He holds that up as an example to us moderns who think of ourselves as very sophisticated, but actually have lost a very sort of nuanced, bi-level kind of view of reality that so many people in history have had. Right, and that's exactly why he cautions us, that if we attempt to appeal some kind of religious sentiment, he called it religious emotion, especially as it pertains to ebbs and flows of government and culture, if we divorce that from religious belief, we run the risk of becoming the authors of our own ruin. Yeah, that's right, because we become revolutionary. Right. So he said that what happens when you lose religion is you become revolutionary, because you have to have a reason to live. And if it's not this theological optimism of Christianity, then it's going to be some kind of modern ideology which promises a worldly salvation. Well, to achieve worldly salvation, you have to harness all the reins and power of government and overthrow the existing evil society that we are, right, and overthrow it completely to rebuild, the new, future happiness. And that has never worked, and regularly in history leads to incredible amounts of destruction. Yep, it's babies that are thrown out with the bathwater, and inevitably all you wind up doing is causing a massacre. And again, Dawson was prophetic. He saw that this was what was happening. In fact, exactly what you just mentioned, he would call it appealing to a kind of moral and spiritual sentiment within the loyalty of the members. But here's the problem. If we don't find common truths, and I mean objective truth, that binds us, a recognition of principles and ideals that are transcendental, then those very members will wind up turning against us. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so Dawson is looking at individual cultures, their ways of life, to appreciate them, sort of their way of, believing and doing. But you're right. He also connected individual cultures to what our humanity, our universal humanity, well, we could call it natural law. He doesn't use that phrase a lot, but that's what he means. This idea that there's something transcendent above the different human cultures and even ages in time, which allows different peoples to exchange ideas with each other and really grow in truth, and which is the essential definition of progress. And so that kind of local knowledge, particulars of history go along with a kind of universal vision of what it means to be human.
Yep. And the universal vision ultimately grounds itself in the recognition of the divine. In other words, for Dawson, man only truly finds his real meaning when he's connected to God. And therefore, culture only finds its true meaning when it's connected to God.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So, we're running out of time in this segment, but Joseph, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Why should our listeners pick up Christopher Dawson and read, and what would be a good starting point?
Sure. Boy, Dawson's work has so much to say to us today. It's becoming more relevant, right? It's being all republished right now by the Catholic University of America Press, all 23 of his books on progress, on European unity, on the making of Europe, and education, politics, all kinds of things. So I would urge everyone to check out the Dawson page at the Catholic University of America Press and then see what's coming out soon.
Thank you so much, Joseph. My guest, Joseph Stuart, Program Chair of History, a Fellow of Catholic Studies at the University of Mary. We've been talking about the heritage and legacy of Christopher Dawson, this great commentator. I'm Marcus Peter.